1842. Sir, in case of my death on this journey I am about to undertake, I avail myself of your Majesty's gracious permission to advise that you should entrust the formation of a new government. The weather was perfect, and the moon full. I sat in the co-pilot seat, admiring the shining sea, and thinking of the anxious battle, now at its height.
The battle for Tobruk. Tobruk, symbol of the fighting spirit and resistance of the British 8th Army. Tobruk, the last stronghold before Egypt, now fiercely defended by British and Australian troops against the crack Africa Corps led by the Desert Fox, Rommel.
I sat thinking of that anxious battle. For the last 2 hours of the trip, we flew over land. And it was about 7 o'clock when we approached. As we gradually descended, I noticed that the top of the Washington Monument was about our level, and I impressed upon Captain Kelly Rogers that it would be peculiarly unfortunate if we brought our story to an end by hitting this of all other objects in the world. He assured me that he would take special care to miss it.
In the course of these flights, I found him a wonderful passenger. He was well known for the regard in which he held the captain of the ship in which he traveled, that when he was aboard that ship, the captain was in command, not the Prime Minister, and so it was towards me.
Early the next morning, the 19th, I flew to Hyde Park. The President was on the local airfield and saw us make the roughest bump landing I have experienced. He welcomed me with the greatest cordiality and drove me all over the estate. In this drive, I had some thoughtful moments. An ingenious arrangement enabled him to do everything with his arms, which were amazingly strong. He invited me to feel his biceps, saying that a famous prize fighter had envied them. This was reassuring, but I confess that when on several occasions the car backed on the precipices over the Hudson, I hoped the mechanical devices and brakes would show no defects.
Concerning the visit, Inspector Thompson, Churchill's bodyguard, says,
of all the places that I visited during the war with Mr. Churchill, in my opinion, Hyde Park was the worst. I mean Hyde Park, New York, not the one up the road. The place was very vulnerable, which meant that it had to be covered by security officers for the whole 24 hours, and everybody that moved about either left or entered the premises was checked by these men. I hated the place. There was no peace there for anyone. The Roosevelts were always on the move. If they wanted something, they meant to have it. Day and night, I had to be on the alert, walking about in the grounds all over the damn place, with a creel on my hip, a hot dog in my hand, and often a basket of sandwiches on my head and my trousers covered with mustard. And to add to all that, very often, a half a dozen Roosevelt grandchildren trailing me wherever I went. I'd rather have checkers in the Blitz than a weekend in Hyde Park any day.
While Churchill confers at Hyde Park, the battle in the desert is reaching its climax. If Tobruk should fall to the Germans, the Suez Canal and all Egypt are threatened. The specter of another Dunkirk rises to haunt the Allies, for the Mediterranean will be their only escape hatch.
Late on the night of the 20th, the presidential train bore us back from Hyde Park to Washington, which we reached about 8 o'clock the next morning. I had my breakfast and then went to see the president in his study. Presently, a telegram was put into the president's hands. He passed it to me without a word. It said, Tobruk has surrendered. 25,000 men taken prisoner. I did not attempt to hide the shock I had received. It was a bitter moment. Defeat is one thing. Disgrace is another. What can we do to help? Said Roosevelt. I replied at once, give us as many Sherman tanks as you can spare and ship them to the Middle East as quickly as possible.
300 Sherman tanks with engines not yet installed are put into 6 of the fastest ships available and sent off to the Suez Canal. The ship that contains all the engines is sunk by a submarine off Bermuda.
Without a single word from us, the President put a further supply into another fast ship and dispatched it to overtake the convoy. A friend in need is a friend indeed.
Discussion in Washington on the future conduct of the war continues. The hard-pressed Russians are demanding a second front. It is not certain whether or not the Soviet army will be able to hold out. The situation is precarious. The Allies are not yet ready to land an army in Europe. It falls upon Churchill to go to Moscow and tell Stalin why a second front in Europe could not yet be launched.
Meanwhile, the surrender of Tobruk reverberated around the world in flaring headlines which said, "Anger in England. Tobruk fall may bring change of government. Churchill to be censured."
June 25. After a 7-day visit with President Roosevelt, Churchill returns to London and is faced with a vote of censure condemning his conduct of the war.
A motion was placed in the following term: that this House, while paying tribute to the heroism and endurance of the armed forces, has no confidence in the central direction of the war. I said at once that we should give full opportunity for a public debate and fix July the 1st for the occasion.
Mr. Horb Elisha sums up the main case against the government. The Prime Minister said that we would hold Singapore, that we would hold Crete, that we had smashed the German army in Libya. When I read that he had said that we are going to hold Egypt, my anxieties became even greater. How can anyone place reliance in a man's judgments that have repeatedly turned out to be misguided? In 100 days, we lost our empire in the Far East. What will happen in the next 100 days? Churchill follows this powerful speech. The House is crammed.
This long debate has now reached its final stage. What a remarkable example it has been of the unbridled freedom of our parliamentary institutions in the time of war. Everything that could be thought of or raked up has been used to weaken confidence in the government, has been used to prove that ministers are incompetent and to weaken their confidence in themselves. I am in favor of this freedom, which no other country would use or dare to use in times of mortal peril such as those through which we are passing. I willingly accept responsibility for everything that has happened. I ask no favors. I am your servant, and you have the right to dismiss me when you please. Meanwhile, the battle crisis in Egypt grew steadily worse, and it was widely believed that Cairo and Alexandria would soon fall to Rommel's flaming sword. It seemed that we should reach a climax on the parliamentary and desert fronts at the same moment.
While the vote in the House of Parliament is being counted, Rommel, who has already smashed across the Egyptian frontier, pushed the retreating British 8th Army across the hot sands to El Alamein. England waits to see if Churchill will be dismissed. The world waits. Churchill waits. In London, the vote of censure is defeated by 400 votes to 25. His leadership reinforced, Churchill flies off to Moscow, stopping en route in Cairo to reorganize the high command in the Desert Campaign.
On August the 5th, I visited the Alamein positions. I became the man on the spot. Instead of sitting at home and waiting for the news from the front, I could send it myself. This was exhilarating.
Churchill appoints a new commander-in-chief in the Middle East, General Alexander. General Montgomery is made field commander of the British 8th Army.
Late on the night of August the 10th, we started for Moscow. I pondered on my mission to this sullen, sinister Bolshevik state. I was sure it was my duty to have it all out, face to face with Stalin. No second front in 1942. It was like carrying a large lump of ice to the North Pole. Repaired to the Kremlin and were received by Stalin and Molotov with their interpreter. Then began a most unpleasant discussion. I said I feared the news I brought was not good news. I emphasized that we wanted to take the strain off the Russians. If we could gain North Africa, Hitler would have to bring his air force back. We argued for about 2 hours, during which he said a great many disagreeable things, especially about our being afraid to fight the Germans, and if we tried it like the Russians, we should find it not so bad.
Present at the meeting was the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Lord Alanbrooke.
Well, Stalin put it pretty plainly what he felt about what had been stating to him. In fact, there were a lot of insults poured out from his mouth as to when we were going to start fighting, why we hadn't started, informing us that we wouldn't find it too bad if we ever did start, and so on. It was definitely intended to be insulting. And the reactions on Churchill were just exactly what you might expect. He thumped the table with a crash, and he started off one of those orations of his, which I can only remember the starting line, which I remember very well, was if it wasn't for the fighting qualities shown by the Red Army at Stalingrad. And then it went on to tell him a lot of other things, all in this very high-flown language. The reaction of this flow of language from Winston on Stalin was very remarkable. He got up at once, and he was still sucking this bent pipe. A slow smile came over his face, and as Winston's interpreter started to interpret what he'd been saying, he held out his hand, stopped the interpreter, and through his own interpreter, he said, "I don't understand a word of what you're saying, but by God, I like your sentiment."
Stalin presses for a landing on the French coast by British and American troops. The Germans will then have to divert many divisions from the Russian front.
I inquired whether he'd ever asked himself why Hitler did not come to England in 1940 when he was at the height of his power. Fact was that Hitler was afraid of the operation. It is not so easy to cross the Channel. I then explained precisely Operation Torch with its landings of British and American troops on the northwest coast of Africa and the advantages they would bring in freeing the Mediterranean. To illustrate my point, I had meanwhile drawn a picture and explained to Stalin with the help of this picture how it was our intention to attack the soft belly of the crocodile as we attacked his hard snout.
Stalin seems suddenly to grasp the strategic advantages of Torch. He then abruptly invites Churchill and his party to dinner at 8 o'clock the next night.
Silly tales have been told of how these Soviet dinners became drinking bouts. There is no truth whatsoever in this. The Marshal and his colleagues invariably drank their toast from tiny glasses, taking only a sip on each occasion. I had been well brought up. When on August 24th I returned to London, much remained to be decided about the final shaping of our plans. And the next day, Generals Eisenhower and Clark came to dine with me to discuss the state of the operation. The Irish stew that my wife was always able to get turned out to be very popular with my American guests, and especially with General Eisenhower. I soon began to call him Ike. On September the 8th, I asked Ike for his view on the final date of attack on Africa. November the 8th was his answer.
Meanwhile, Rommel's Africa Corps plunges toward Cairo. British forces repulse the Germans, and Rommel is forced to take a defensive position. He waits. Montgomery waits. From Egypt, General Alexander sends the following message to Churchill. It is essential that the counterattack should be launched on the full moon. October 23, the night of the full moon. General Alexander telegraphs a single word to Churchill. Zip. November 6th, General Alexander sends this message to Churchill. Ring out the bells. The 8th Army is advancing.
But this Battle of Egypt, in itself so important, was designed and timed as a prelude, a counterpart of the momentous enterprise at the western end of the Mediterranean. Enterprise under United States command. Our Army, Air Force, and Navy bearing an honorable and important share.
November 8th, Operation Torch begins. Allied troops land on the beaches at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers.
This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. In order to celebrate the battle, directions are being given to ring the bells throughout the land. African undertakings in the East and in the West were two aspects of a grand design, vast in its scope, honorable in its motive, noble in its aim. Rejoice, rejoice, but do not relax.